All right, so today we're looking at Proto-Renaissance. We've already kind of looked at some of this in terms of the painting frescoes of Cimabue and Giotto. We're looking at roughly the same time period. But now we're going to start to look at a little bit of architecture. Not a lot of developments here. What this class actually is, I probably should rename it from architecture instead of architecture, is more like what's happening in Italy at this time. But we're going to look at some of the buildings as well. So again, just to give you an idea of where we are in this transitional period, sometimes called Proto-Renaissance, sometimes called transitional period. It has different names for different times. The Proto-Renaissance didn't exist in other places. This is really just a period of time and events that took place in northern Italy, what we now today call northern Italy. We're going to look at a map in a little bit. There was a Proto-Renaissance of sorts that took place in northern Europe and other countries. We're going to be looking at that in another class, probably in the next class. But where it happened was crucial. You have to kind of understand what's happening in Italy in the 1400s. So Italy as we know it didn't exist, right, until late 1800s, early 1900s. So Italy was not unified until much, much later.
Wait, Sicily's that big? Or is it? I thought it was like a tiny little island.
No,
Oh.
it's fairly large. So like most other places in Europe, if you look at any map of Europe in basically from like the 1400s all the way through about the 1800s until the Holy Roman Empire, you're not going to see Germany. You're not going to see France. You're not going to see, right? You're going to see lots of little kingdoms. France actually had more of a kingdom, but Germany, Luxembourg, all these places had these little independent nations, so to speak. And this is definitely the case here in Italy. Kingdom of Naples was big. Papal states at this time fairly large, but beyond that, everything else is pretty small.
Papal states meaning Pope?
Mm-hmm. Pope is in charge of those. There were skirmishes, there were rivalries, there were all kinds of rivalries and little wars happening between some of these states during this time and all throughout the Renaissance. But for the most part, things are relatively stable. There would be a little battle, there would be a little skirmish. You know, it would be, you took our wool trading route, we want it back. Little battle, lasts a few days. Sometimes a duke steps in from Naples and helps broker a peace, or the Pope steps in and helps broker a peace, and then they go back to life. So it wasn't this all-out kind of chaos that was happening. We don't have situations like the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals invading huge swaths of land like was happening in earlier periods. So things are pretty stable. Everyone's kind of happy with where they're at for the most part. I'm way oversimplifying, but you get the point. We have republics. So Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Siena were republics. Duchies, Milan and Savoy, kingdoms, right? We have all these different types of forms of government from all these different places, but they're all relatively the same. They're these independent states. When there's peace, when there's prosperity, when there's peace, there's prosperity. When there's prosperity, there's the rise of a middle class. There's the rise of the upper class. And what happens? The upper class wants to leave their mark on things. They want to reinforce their hometown, not just with power and with money, but with culture. It happens in every civilization, right? We see this every single time. Whenever there's peace, there's prosperity. When there's prosperity, the culture is enhanced. And so we're going to start to see this throughout this period in the 1300s and 1400s throughout Italy. Okay? So let's go to Florence. We're going to spend more time in Florence probably than any other city, especially next semester, fall semester of next year. But Florence is starting to kind of get its feet under itself. It was a merchant town, first and foremost. It was a trading place. And we're going to get into more of the history of it in a little bit. But
it would be so hard to build in those cities, like everything's so close together.
Yeah, and so
Like renovate or
most of the time you don't build new. You just renovate what's already there. Sometimes they would tear things down, but for the most part, it's things stay pretty much the way that they are.
Wait, so this was before Renaissance or after Renaissance?
This is before the Renaissance.
Oh.
So this is a church that's called the Or San Michel, and it doesn't look like a church.
Which one's right?
This big blocky building, and there's not really a good way to get a good distance picture of it because there's all this stuff all around it. And the reason for that is because most churches are set up with a piazza or a square in front of it, or a some sort of a place in front of it where people can gather in processions and all that stuff.
Streets are tiny. What a church?
But this wasn't a church originally. This is really unique in the history of a lot of churches throughout Italy, in that it wasn't a church. It was built as a grain market in 1337. Between 1380 and 1404, it was converted into a church, and it was used as the chapel of Florence's powerful craft and trade guilds. We've talked about guilds in Catholic Social Principles last semester, right? What is a guild? It's a group of people so that they can, so there would be the wool spinners guild, there would be the stonemasons guild, there would be the woodworkers guild, right? There's the cloth dyers guild, right? Every major industry in the city of Florence had a guild and had a trade. And so this was the church for them.
Like, so they just can come?
Yeah, so this was like, you would have a meeting in one of the other places nearby, or maybe in the second floor area or the first floor, the parish hall, so to speak, what we would call the parish hall today. You'd have a meeting of the grain merchants, and then you'd go to mass, right? And then you'd have benediction, right? So this was where you'd have your meetings. This was the kind of civic center for the working men of Florence at the time. And it was very much tied to the church, which is a great thing, right? So you'd go and have your meeting, you'd discuss the rates and who's going to become the president of the guild, and then Father would come and give a spiritual conference, and then you'd have mass or benediction or something like that. So it's a very Catholic-centered way of doing business. But it was transformed into a church. They said, let's basically turn it into a church. That's why it looks a little bit weird. On the ground floor, we still see these. This is how it looks today. And so what's interesting about this is that it's really not built as a church, but you still see the original these were the original open doorways. This used to be the grain market. So it was kind of set up like a trade house, right? So you'd have all these openings, all these entrances, and you can still see them here. And it didn't have all this decoration when it was a grain trading house, but then they added this decoration a little bit later on, and then closed up these doors just to make one main door of the church. What's striking about this church is the statues on the outside. So each one of the guilds commissioned a statue of their own patron saint. Each guild had their own patron saint. And so they commissioned a statue of their patron saint to decorate the outside of the church, and each guild had their own carving. It wasn't without some controversy, though, because we can't just have nice things. It's cheaper to carve in stone than it is to cast in bronze. We've seen how to cast bronze. It's a very labor-intensive process. The metal is heavy, it's expensive, etc. And so some of the more wealthy, so they all got together and they decided, we're going to decorate this now church with our statues of our patron saints. And everyone's like, great. But a few of the more wealthy guilds, because there were some guilds that were more wealthy than others.
This was one guild's church.
No, this was the church for all the guilds.
Oh, okay.
So some of the guilds said, hey, don't tell the other guilds, we're going to do our statue out of bronze. So a couple of the guilds had their statues done out of bronze instead of stone, and that caused some problems between the different guilds. Again, can't have nice things. Yeah.
When's a guild again?
A guild is like a trade union. So you would have a guild, so you'd have the guild of all the wool merchants. So you'd have 10 different wool merchants living in Florence, right? But they're all part of the same guild. This is to make sure that no one's cheating each other. Like, this guy's not charging super, super low prices. This guy's not charging super, super high prices. It's a way to kind of keep competitive advantage. And also, it's a way for apprentices to start to work. And it was almost like college in a way. So the guild would set up, hey, this is the training that every wool dyer or wool merchant needs to go through. And once you get that, then you become a tradesman. Then you become a junior apprentice. Then you become a craftsman. Then you become a master. And then they would elect someone to oversee all of the wool merchant that's happening. So there was still competition between them, but it was a friendlier competition, right? So the statues that are here on the outside today, these are actually replicas. The originals are now inside the church, and so these are the original statues, and they are absolutely gorgeous. This is where we start to see some of the real artistry of the Renaissance starting to kind of peek its head through. They're starting to go back to, and we're already seeing this in statuary, they're starting to go back to the classical way of sculpting. And we're going to see much more of those in a little bit.
So realistic.
The inside is beautiful, even though the outside is kind of ugly looking. The inside is beautiful. They brought in a Gothic tabernacle that was in an earlier church that had been that was falling apart, and so they brought in this altar.
Is that set altar or that's the main altar?
That's the main altar.
Oh.
So it's all things considered, it's a relatively small church, but this is called the Bejeweled Gothic Tabernacle, and it encases a painting of an icon. So we're still seeing some of those older icons. This is by Bernardo Dotti. We haven't talked about him, but he was an earlier contemporary of some of the other Cimabue Giotto that we've been talking about earlier. But this is just.
That's the tabernacle?
This is like the top of the altar.
Oh.
So.
What does it say?
The tabernacle actually would have actually been on the side, so that was sometimes common. So, is there art historically? Is there something of great significance to Orsan Michel? Not really. The statuary, not really notable. But I wanted to show this to you just to kind of give you a sense of this is how civic life was in Florence. This is how Catholic culture is and really should be. Right? There should be, you don't separate work and faith, right? Your work is tied up with your faith. There's feast days. You go and you go to mass together as a guild, as a business, and you worship together, you work together, you pray together, you play together, and it's a really beautiful way of, this is what we mean when we say restoring Catholic culture. It's something like this, except maybe don't tick off your buddies and do a bronze statue instead of a marble statue, but you do whatever. Here's another side altar in Orsan Michel. You can see all the frescoes, beautiful frescoes that were being done. No, it's Italian Gothic. Still Italian Gothic.
I like the statues on the altar. So
Yeah. So that statue I think is actually later. That's a Baroque statue, but. All right. So now we get into Siena versus Florence. Yeah.
It would be above the church because the building was super tall, but the building isn't tall.
So they got rid of the second floor and just opened it up. So it's just all an open church now.
Whoa. So where was this church?
This is in Florence.
Florence. Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we're going to move to Siena. Siena and Florence, very bitter rivals still today. If you say you're from Florence, you're from Siena, it's not. They don't hate each other, but it's kind of like ASU versus University of Arizona, right? It's kind of like that rivalry, like, oh, you're from there, oh, okay, right? It's sort of still like that today. Back then, you were rivals, right? Shakespeare writing Romeo and Juliet, rival families, right? That sort of thing was happening. That was absolutely true. You do not mix with the dirty Sienese. You do not mix with the dirty Florentines.
Wait, what you call them? Sienese?
Sienese, yep.
That's actually what they're called.
Siena at one point became the most powerful banking city on the continent. We have noble families that were fighting between themselves, but they were united under this one large family in Siena, and they spent centuries, again, with these little skirmishes fighting the Florence Guelph family in a bitter rivalry over power, wealth, influence, and territory. Despite the fractious goings-on, the city's nobility managed to organize a strong republic, but trouble and rivalry, both internal and with its greatest rival, Florence, was never far away. By the time we get to this era, the 1400s, late 1300s, 1400s, things are pretty stable. But again, there's always going to be these little skirmishes breaking out. Every 10, 15 years, there's going to be a little battle. There's going to be a little skirmish going on. And it usually has to do over hurt feelings and people getting their nose bent out of shape. There's a story here. I'm not going to read it out to you, but there's a story there at the bottom talking about the main battle that was happening in in Siena. But this is just to kind of give you an idea. So this is Siena, built in the hilltops of Tuscany.
Have you been there?
Mm-hmm. A long time ago. I haven't been recently, but it's beautiful, right? You really have the sense that you're walking back in history when you walk through the city.
When they have to like add parts of the city and stuff, do they try to keep it so it looks like that, or do they modernize?
So yeah, so on the outskirts there are kind of your stereotypical grocery stores, shopping centers, things like that on the outskirts. So strip malls, that sort of thing on the outside of the city today, but on the inside, no, it all still looks the same. They don't tear down buildings.
So do people don't really own houses?
Apartments. Mm-hmm.
Or
Yep.
a lot of money?
They're not too bad, all things considered.
That's
Florence, it's kind of a rough picture, but you get the idea. Florence, much larger, a much larger city. It's on this kind of larger plain. There's the River Arno right next to it, and so it has. It became a larger city, but Siena had a lot more power during this early period. Later on, that's going to flip, and Florence is going to become much more powerful. In your notes, that Battle of Monteperti. Excuse me. This is a painting in the town hall of Siena showing the battle, this glorious battle where the Sienese defeated the Florentines. They dedicated the keys of the city to the Virgin Mary on the altar on the unyet finished cathedral. And then the next morning they marched out. They inflicted a defeat on Florence so complete that they continued on and razed Florence. It's funny, they marched on Florence.
Which side is Florence?
What's that?
Which side is Florence?
I don't know. But basically, if you see people getting defeated, those are probably Florentines, because this is a Sienese painting, right? So they're gonna depict their history as very glorious. They marched on Florence, and again, they didn't have artillery. They didn't have guns. It was all lances, swords, those types of things. And they cut down trees right nearby Florence, and they used the trees as battering rams to get into first the city gates, and then into the portions of government of the city of Florence as well. And so they took these battering rams and they carried them back to Siena, and they still stand today attached to the pillars of the Siena Cathedral, to the Cathedral of Siena. So you can still see two of these battering rams today commemorating this great battle, this victory of the Sienese over the Florentines. And they're still there today. Yeah, those are ways to hold it.
That is kind of nice.
So very medieval, right? But you go there today in 2023 and you see this relic, so to speak, of this battle that happened. When was it? Back in 1260, right? So nearly 800 years ago, or a little over 800 years ago. Since we're talking about the Cathedral of Siena, well, let's talk about it. The Siena Duomo. This was constructed. Remember, it was just unfinished during the time of this great battle in 1260, and so they ended up finishing it just after the battle in 1263. Has the form of a Latin cross. And the thing, yeah.
What does Duomo mean?
Duomo is just like the main church, So it doesn't mean dome. So we've seen the Milan Duomo,
Yeah, same.
the Florence Duomo, the Siena Duomo. It's the main city church. It's the main cathedral church of the city. Done very much in the Italian Gothic style. If you look at the front, you can see, right, there's more carvings than we've seen in some of the other Italian Gothic, but the rose window is there, but it's clear glass. It's not stained glass like we've seen in Germany and France. But the thing that is really striking about this cathedral is the alternating colors, that kind of zebra pattern of black and white stone. And those are carved from quarries right nearby Siena. The statuary is,
That's crazy.
again, this is done 1263, so we're still squarely in the Gothic period.
How do you get the hair like that?
Elongated figures, very medieval looking figures still. But it's a really beautiful, beautiful cathedral. And then there were mosaics that were done This is, again, relatively rare. Sorry, mosaics, yeah. This is relatively rare
Those are mosaic?
in Italy, especially on the outside. You just don't see that very often. So this is something that makes
Wow,
the
those
Siena
are
Cathedral pretty unique.
Oh, those are
Yeah,
But I imagine
but
How are they?
yeah, it's allowing more light to come in. Because again, this is the west, so it's going to really allow the church to be bathed in light.
How do they make them so realistic? Oh my. Yeah, how did they get up there?
It's a zebra.
It looks
Where's
like
the,
the
Big scaffolds.
Where's the battery room?
It's on one of those pillars. I think we'll see it again here in a little bit.
Big right there.
the dome on the.
Yeah, it might be that one. It might be,
And then there's one on the other side too.
and then right
Why are
there.
they so long?
These, the battering rams,
Yeah.
you get a lot of people behind it and a lot of force, momentum. You can break through just about anything.
Wait, where are the battering rams?
Very big. Huh?
Where are the battering rams?
Would
Maybe
those
I'll-
be
maybe I'll
solid
do that.
piece of wood?
Uh-huh.
Like
They
tree
just
wood?
stick them up there.
Yeah, they're tied to the pillars.
No, they're just.
So the dome was done a little bit later. The dome actually was done by Bernini, who we'll see. Seniors, you've already seen Bernini plenty. Bernini, he was the one who did quite a bit of St. Peter's Cathedral, St. Peter's Basilica. So the dome was done by Bernini later, but the church itself was done in about 1263. And again, you see this very, very Gothic. Everything is still very Gothic, right? You have the painted ceilings, but the transept, the arches, everything is super, super Gothic. The extra gilded decoration and this whole dome, you can kind of tell it's a different style because it was done later.
It's so dark. It looks so Egypt-y.
Yeah. This is a depiction of the main altar. And again,
Oh, wow.
all of the painting here, all of the paintings here,
Very Gothic.
all of this, that's all Baroque.
No, it's pretty, but the statues are so
Right in the middle.
Yeah.
See that?
Black.
That's a reliquary. I'm not sure what is in there.
Probably
Okay. So a lot of the decorations, like these little cherubs, those are all Baroque. This is like a baldacchino, so it's meant to cover the altar,
Candlelight.
right? So similar to when the priest is carrying the Blessed Sacrament, right? He has the little canopy, umbrellina, the little canopy over him. Same sort of thing. An altar is actually supposed to have some sort of a covering over it, generally speaking.
Well, look at the organelle.
Yeah.
Where?
Again, that's a later Baroque organ as well.
Or Josh McClone. Oh, I remember these.
And then we see some frescoes
That looks very Renaissance.
inside. Yep. All right, so let's look at some civic architecture, the Siena Palazzo Pubblico. So Palazzo Pubblico, also known as the town hall. This is the main town hall.
Take this picture.
No, not this one. I haven't been to Siena since I was 17, so
So romantic.
I don't have any pictures of that.
Oh, you
Are you
didn't have a
serious?
phone back then?
You
I'm not kidding.
No.
Maybe I should go.
Whoa, that's big.
What's
man.
that?
Have you done a lot of like traveling for this?
So
Do
yeah,
you go for the art or for like the, well, I mean, art is
people.
vacation.
And the food.
and the food.
Wait, did you have a flip phone or anything?
No.
They're just like
Like, you didn't have any form of communication.
Mm.
Oh, where do they? When were like the little?
Guys, do you guys know that's Big Ben?
Mm.
Pager.
No. Yeah, I had a pager for my drug deals.
They
Yeah.
moved it from London to New York.
Construction of this began in 1297. This was the seat not only of the city but of the Republic of Siena, right? So remember, Siena is not just a town; it is the entire territory, it's the entire government. So the surrounding towns would be under the Republic as well. Exterior, very much a medieval-looking building. It has some Gothic influences. We can see some of the Gothic influences in the archways and the windows, etc. But it looks like a medieval castle. The tower was actually built later. This is what it looked like at the very beginning. At the top of this facade is a large round bronze plate. This is called the Christogram, the symbol used by Saint Bernard, Saint Bernardino. And this symbol would later be used by the Jesuits as well. So this is where you see this symbol all the time. If you see this, it usually means it's a Jesuit church. But again, this is right on the front of the city hall, right? Just to kind of give you an idea of, again,
Jesuit is Jew, right?
Did you?
no, that's the Society of Jesus. So St. Francis, St. Ignatius of Loyola founded them. Okay. So you can still see medieval, sort of, but also parts of it are Gothic. It's being built right during this same kind of transitional period. The campanile or bell tower was built a little bit later, 1325 to 1344. And when they built it, Florence had already built their town hall with a bell tower on it, and they said, well, gotta build it, and gotta build it bigger.
Yeah.
So of course it was bigger. At the time, it was the tallest structure in Italy. It's been fitted with a mechanical clock, an automatic clock that rings a bell since the 14th century. So since the 1300s, no one goes in and rings it. It just does it automatically.
How is it powered?
Weights and pulleys, just like a grandfather clock. Big ones, big pulleys. On the interior, nearly every room has frescoes. Some of them are in worse repair than others. A lot of them have been.
Very good one.
That's still in the process of being restored, and part of it is just lost. So they're not going to repair that section down there on the bottom right. But every room, there were meeting rooms. This was the meeting rooms for the civic government as well.
Gorgeous.
And again, we see this constant reflection back to the faith. Siena was not just a republic, it was a Catholic republic. Same thing with Florence. Florence was a Catholic republic, which is funny because they were constantly fighting each other, but it doesn't matter, right? Catholics fight each other. And this is just zooming in, showing various frescoes, various details of important battles throughout Sienese history.
Wait, was Florence?
They were fighters.
Catholic also?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all the republics were Catholic.
So Catholic and Catholic were fighting each other?
Mm-hmm. Every republic in Italy was Catholic.
That's so pretty. Is that the ceiling?
This is one of the ceilings of one of the meeting halls.
Whoa.
So how do you paint like that? You're like,
Big scaffolds, and you're laying on your back,
Immaculate.
or you're crouching down and painting like that.
oh my gosh, humpback.
So not all the paintings are religious in nature. Some of them are allegorical, some of them are mythical. But you get kind of the idea. This fresco is called The Allegory and Effects of Good and Bad Government. So again, they're starting early on here in the 1300s. They're starting to look back to classical times for some of the inspiration of some of their artworks. Excuse me, and we're going to see that really kick off as we move into Florence next semester as well.
Are those American pennies or what is that?
Where's that?
There's pesos.
What do you
Like,
say next
see on
semester?
the
you mean
edge
next
how there's
year?
like the coins?
They're
They're not American.
Those
On
are
the brown
I
part,
think this was
bottom
made
right.
before
on the
America.
arches.
I think
Oh.
this was built before America. was
No,
made.
those are portraits, like bronze portraits of important people.
You're asking.
All right, so that's about it. That's the main stuff I wanted to cover. But I figured, what the heck? Let's take a little tour throughout Italy. What the heck?
Can we go? Can we go?
This is
The
you
saturation is
go
so high on that.
go.
Everybody.
Go.
Where should we go? If we go visit like one part.
In Europe,
Go.
what would you recommend?
Yeah.
Go to Rome and then travel up to Tuscany. That's what I would say.
Actually going
And visit Siena, visit Florence. They're absolutely gorgeous.
Okay, we're dummies.
So this is Siena. You can see it's built on a hilltop. We couldn't really see it from some of the other pictures, but you can see here how it's very easily defended. Right?
Allergy season must be unbearable.
Allergy season is pretty intense. So Siena is definitely built on a hilltop. This is in a section of Italy called Tuscany. Right? You've probably heard of Tuscany. Tuscany is very hilly. There's a lot of agriculture, but there's a lot of hills, and there's all these little towns, and each town, you look across kind of the horizon. If you get up on top of a larger hill and you look across the horizon, you'll see all these little towns. They're just called hill towns, and they were built on the top of a hill to be able to easily defend themselves from other people. So there's a view inside Tuscany from the neighboring, some of the neighboring countryside.
What's that building down there?
So some of those other buildings would be like a monastery, so to speak, or a convent. So just outside the city walls, a little bit more secluded. And then this is views of Tuscany.
Oh, there are like little towns everywhere.
So you can see these little town over here, right? Very, very agrarian. It's pretty warm. It's pretty dry, perfect for growing grapes. That's why some of the best wine in the world comes from Tuscany, right? Tuscan grapes. So Chianti and those types
So
of
like
wines.
those hills right there would be like
If If it's dry and warm,
One second. What's that?
Sorry, those hills right there would be used for what? Or just no,
Yeah, so they-
green right there.
Right here?
Those things, yeah.
Grain. So this is wheat. So there's a lot of wheat that's grown. There's a lot of sunflowers that's grown. Canola.
Why sunflowers?
It's a little more of a hotter, arid climate. So it's not super arid. It's not like here,
Everything's so green that it's so hot and warm and dry all the time.
because they do have rainy periods. So the spring is rainy
Isn't there
all
rain?
spring long. Yeah,
That's so
winter and
great.
spring is rain, and then the summer is pretty hot, pretty dry.
Oh my.
That grass is insane.
So Tuscany,
Just gonna roll down the
absolutely beautiful.
Just
Yes,
update.
like in a Peter Rabbit too.
As we move back,
I'm speeding up a lot.
so
It's not like
what do you do if you're very wealthy and you live in Siena? Well, you have a summer villa.
Not my fault.
Just like the Roman emperors would have, they'd have their summer villas. If you're wealthy, you're a wealthy cloth merchant, you have a summer villa and you escape the city because the city, all the stone is radiating all the heat. You get out into the countryside. So that's how they would escape the heat of the summer. And even still today, basically from,
Can you write them out?
yeah. Even still today, from about early July till the end of August, things shut down. There's just not a lot of stuff happening. People take 8-week-long holidays. That's just built into the culture. That's just what you do. You just stop working for 8 weeks and you just travel and you relax and you go to the countryside with your family. It's very much that way in Italy. It's very much that way in Spain and in France. It's a great way to live. I don't know why we don't do it, but we don't.
I wish your sky got like that.
But that's just kind of what people do.
That sky is really
When I was visiting Rome and Florence, when I was like I said, when I was 17, I was there during August. The other times I've been have been during spring, so everything's going on and everything's happening. But I was there in August, and basically from August 15th until the end of August, everything's closed. Like there would be some shops, some restaurants are open, but about 3/4 of the restaurants they're closed. 3/4 of the shops closed. August 15th, it's essentially a national holiday, right? The Assumption. Holy days, they're closed. We couldn't get gas. Every gas station was closed. We couldn't get gas. We couldn't, right? So everything is just shut down. And it would just say, chiuso per feria, so closed for the holiday. Good luck. All right. It's a much simpler, it's a better way of living. In my opinion, it's a better way of living, right? It's everything's shut down. You're forced to recreate, you're forced to be with your family during those days. This is another town that I wanted to draw your attention to. This is the town of San Gimignano. This is about 35 miles from Florence. It's between Florence and Siena. And this is another example of a small hill town.
So it was on the side of Florence or Siena?
Why did they get?
I don't remember.
Are those
Wait,
grapes?
Yeah, those are vineyards right there.
It's so pretty.
So this is a town that I visited again when I was about 17, and it was we rented a house just nearby, and the town was just that's about it. You go in, there's the city wall is still there, and the people live in the town, and they do their work, and that's where they stay. But
What is
why
it
these
stand for,
towers?
son?
St. James.
Scouts.
Look out.
Saint what?
St. James.
They were
James?
scouts.
James.
James.
So the city was, just to kind of give you the idea of kind of the culture of the Italians, and I'm way over generalizing here, but
How cute the little tree is.
there would always be some sort of a rivalry happening, even in a small town like this. So San Gimignano was founded, and there were two families that founded the town. And for a lot of the period of time, they got along. But for some periods of time during this period, 1200s, 1300s, they weren't getting along, even in this small town of maybe 2,500 people. So it was this family hated this family. And so one of them built a tower. The other family said, I'm going to build a bigger tower. The other family said, I'm going to build an even bigger tower. The other family said, I'm going to build an even bigger tower. So that's why San Gimignano has
Ended up winning.
all of these towers. I don't remember. But that's why San Gimignano it's kind of called the skyscraper capital of Tuscany. Even though these aren't skyscrapers, they aren't really that tall.
The tallest one, that one or the one in the back?
I don't know which one's which. But
It's so funny.
But again, these little rivalries, these little factions, right? It doesn't matter even if you're part of the Republic. Let's say this is part of the Republic of Florence. I don't know. And you're San Gimignano. No, I'm part of this family. this is my allegiance. I don't talk to the other family on the other side of town. It's
very competitive.
very competitive. Yep. Very, very hot-tempered in a lot of ways. You go to Siena. I was there again on August 15th in Siena, and these neighborhoods would have, there would be a parade in each neighborhood of Siena, and each neighborhood has its own flag. And if you lived in that neighborhood, that was your flag. And there was a huge horse race that went around inside the city, throughout the city, kind of like, the Grand Prix with car racing.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of them do. So it's incredibly dangerous, and the horses end up in that palazzo, the Palazzo Pubblico that we saw.
Cobblestones, so, like, you can't really
Yep. Yeah. And so you're cheering for your neighborhood. You're not cheering for Siena, you're cheering for your neighborhood. It's also kind of crazy. At the very beginning, before that Campanile, it's called that big horse race, all the horses and the riders march into the cathedral, and the horses and the riders get blessed by the bishop in the cathedral. It's a really crazy sight. We didn't know it was happening when we got there, and all of a sudden we see all these horses going into a church, and we're like, what? Yeah. And then we see this horse race, we're like, this is crazy.
How is like a town of like 2,500 people like that? How is it sustainable? Like, what are their jobs?
Yeah. So some of them are farmers, so the farms, so they would live in the town and then they go and they farm the neighboring fields. Merchants, cloth sellers, so it's a self-sustaining little town. Nowadays, San Gimignano is very much a tourist town. So people still live there. There's still locals who live there, but now it's probably 70% tourism. But there's still, and restaurants, shops, high-priced belts, locally made belts, and the local wine, the local meats and cheeses. You have butchers, you have people who are making food, and etc. So another view of San Gimignano.
The sun
Holy crap.
is
So, did you name your daughter after Siena? Like,
Well, the saint,
the name?
yeah,
Building's really cool.
The Saint Max.
the saint. This is a view of the inside. This is the main square of San Gimignano.
The Saint.
So
No, the saint's named
the
after.
fountain there, still a medieval
named after Siena.
ancient well. That's where you get your water.
Oh, that's so cool.
But then you can see how
We still get water from there today.
you can.
Is it any good?
Mm-hmm.
Italy. Hey.
Dang.
It looks like the guy from the videos that he makes. Due to the
Mr. Reyes.
Reed Kid.
So this is a city street. This is a city street of San Gimignano. If you have a car, you can get through it, but you're going to get kind of yelled at a little bit. Most people, when you visit San Gimignano, you park on the outside. There's big parking lots on the outside of the town, and then you just walk in.
So if you drive on the inside, people get mad.
Yeah, it's mostly just little delivery vehicles, little delivery scooters, and kind of like golf cart type things. That's how things are delivered.
A lot of birds is whipping that car around.
Yeah. So if you have a delivery, if you have a restaurant, you need all your produce and stuff for the day. There's produce carts that are kind of going to be coming in. It's not going to be a car. One more town I wanted to draw your attention to. This is probably my favorite town in Italy, Cortona. Absolutely ancient. You can see how,
Reminds me like Rapunzel, like the bar place.
yeah, you can see how the stones, the street when it was built, just as an example, the street when it was built with just a little ditch in the middle for water to run through. But nowadays it's like this, right? That's just all the traffic. That's 1,000 years of footsteps that have worn down the stones. Mm-hmm.
That's why it's curvy like that?
Mm-hmm.
Some heavy people.
And you'd be like, well, those are just thin stones. How does it go down? The streets in Italy are not paved with flat stones, like flagstones, like we have out in our courtyard. They're huge blocks. That's how the Romans built their roads. That's why Roman roads are so durable. That's why Roman roads still exist today. The Appian Way, you can still walk on it today, right? The roads that Paul walked and Peter walked. Why? Because these aren't just flat stones. These are huge blocks, and they're sunk in. So they don't move. It's difficult to tear them up, so you don't tear up a street.
Is that like a water fountain right there in between the doors?
It is, yep. So that just connects to the public water source. And this, in every town in Italy, in Rome, in Florence, anywhere, there's these public water fountains. You go by and you just fill up your bottle and you keep going.
Fresh water.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's good. And it's good drinking water. This is the main square of Cortona.
That's legit.
Again, not as beautiful, but it's like it's just stuck in time, right? So that's the main city hall of Cortona. I don't have a picture of the church, but again, just another example of a hill town.
Is that one the church?
So this is the church right here, and in here is buried St. Margaret of Cortona, patron saint of art.
St. Margaret?
St. Margaret of Cortona,
Who's the other dude up
Is
there?
that a,
St. Thomas More.
not a
St.
cloister?
Thomas who?
St. Thomas More. So that's a cloister. It's a monastery. She was a sister. She was a nun, and she had an aptitude for painting, and so she began to paint all of the churches in Cortona. There's several, because as you do. And then she was sent by her abbess to go and paint in other places, in Siena and in Florence, and so she became very prolific and went to paint all these other monastic churches and cathedrals. And so that's why she's patron saint of art. That's why she's up on our wall. The views from Cortona are pretty spectacular because, again, it's built up on this hill. I do have a picture of the church. That's a picture of, so that's the church.
Looks better from a distance.
And then that is the interior.
Oh, that's gorgeous.
And again, pretty small. This is your stereotypical small town Italian church, right?
Small.
It's holding 500 to 800 people, maybe, something like that, max.
They slacking.
But it's not huge.
Because they don't have any pews, so better be.
And then inside the altar, we have St. Margaret.
Wait, that's
Oh
actually
my.
her.
That is her.
Wait, she's not, what's it called?
She's not incorrupt, no. So they essentially preserved her. They embalmed her as best they could. But
They have to like go in and like re-embalm.
yeah, I mean, as long as there's probably humidity controls in there and stuff now. But
So just got a whole altar
But yeah.
for herself.
yeah, so that's the main altar. That's the main altar.
Oh,
So
an altar, that's
So you can see her doing mass.
yeah,
That is so crazy.
That'd be really sick.
yeah. All right, we're gonna head north next time.
That was just one class. This is why I love our history. Because
What?
So like the next year, we do 3 days of our history and 2 days of CSP.
Yeah, or we
No,
just, like,
sorry.
take government off and like